So hello and welcome to Placing People First, a Next Phase podcast celebrating innovations in life sciences. And it's a great pleasure today to be joined by Martino Picardo. Hi, Martino.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. So, Martino was instrumental in the setup of the Stevenage Bioscience Catalyst, and for the last 4 years has been the chairman of Discovery Park in Kent. And today, I'd love to understand more about Martino's background, what led his career in this direction, as well as discussing some of the ongoing innovations that are helping to grow the bioscience sector and to attract the best talent, particularly outside of this so-called golden triangle. So, Martino, to start, really like to learn more about what got you into this sector in the first place. And you've got a PhD in biochemistry. Not every person with a PhD in biochemistry gets to become chairman of a leading science park. So could you please give me a little bit of insight into how you ended up in the position you're in now?
Well, I'll certainly try, Steve, and thank you again for having me on this podcast, and looking forward to having the conversation that we're about to have. So, PhD in biochemistry, how did I get to be chairman of a science park? I tend to think of it as either a series of unfortunate or fortunate circumstances and a real learning point that I use when I'm mentoring people, it's careers are very rarely a straight path. There is no doubt in my mind, looking back, that I always felt early on that I was going to be an academic forever. So I feel like I've had three careers, and the first part was that academic piece where I did my degree in Manchester in biochemistry and then moved into a PhD project around cardiovascular research that was very, very successful, led to quite a lot of publications. And I was on the way back from a conference with my PhD supervisor, who said to me, "What do you want to do next?" And we actually, over a couple of cans of beer on the train, planned to get in touch with the top 5 cardiovascular research centres in the UK, because at that time, and remember how old I am, but at that time, there was very little career development opportunity around, particularly for postdocs in the UK. And I thought it would be a really good experience to go out to the States and get that real quality, cutthroat, competitive environment in my bag. And I did. I went to Houston. I went to Baylor College of Medicine. I was in the Department of Lipid and Atherosclerosis Research at a time when Merck were just developing the first statin drugs. So a lot of my research was around the analysis from a lipid perspective in the body of what these statins could actually do. So massive, massive learning point. And was offered actually a permanent faculty position at Baylor towards the end of the 4-year visa that I was on. And I was pretty close to accepting it. I was married at the time. We were both in science and both could see a really good lifestyle out in the US. And then, I'm a big football fan and I've played football all my life. And this is part of the unfortunate circumstances. I broke my leg playing soccer, and it was a pretty bad break. And I was out of action for 2 or 3 months. And my wife and I looked around the bedside as I was recuperating and realized that most of the people there were either expats, Brits, and certainly very few Americans. And we both looked at each other and said, "What are we doing here?" So we both actually admitted to each other we were feeling homesick and decided to come home. I had 3 options on the table, and one was a postdoc, one was a lectureship at Bristol University, and the interview I completely screwed up. And then the final bit was in industry. I was on a case award on my PhD, and that was with what was then May and Baker, became Rome Polonc in Dagenham. And to cut a long story short, the postdoc in Manchester was the one that I had to take because of the timings, and came back to Manchester, became part of a really good group working on migration stimulating factors, and eventually decided that the salaries were just not going to make it for a married couple with a mortgage at a time when we had the first Black Friday on mortgage rights raises going from 5% to 15%. So I took the big move, Steve, to go from from academia into the dark side, as I knew it then, and went into industry and worked for a fantastic company called Amersham, who became Amersham Pharmacia. And I just learned everything. It was a small company at the time, and they were open and receptive, and the management was open and receptive to scientists learning about marketing, learning about sales, learning about manufacturing. And we were developing a new technology for high throughput screening, of which I became the lead for globally. And it just put me on the road and actually doing what we used to call, and I think we still do, white coat selling. And it's not for everybody. And I loved it. And I loved going into the den of vice presidents of R&D who were able to put and allocate budgets for high throughput screening on the table, but loved to give you a hard time while they were doing it. So I learned so much, and I learned that more cutthroat, competitive environment was actually quite attractive to me. So I then moved from a scientist to a management position, and then when Amersham and Pharmacia came together, I became one of 4 global science directors looking after the next generation of technologies. And then that started to get me into universities and academia and incubators globally in Japan, in the States and everywhere, looking for the next generation of technologies for Amersham, and able to do some of the business development deals and licensing deals that brought big ticket equipment and industry technology leading science into the company, and loved it. And at that time, that was 9 years into a career in industry. I started to get word that Manchester University, my alma mater, if you think about it,
Sure.
and my hometown really, was planning one of the first campus-based incubators in Manchester. And the CEO of the company happened to be one of my mentors. And he said, look, I think it's time you came home. And so I went into what was then Manchester Incubator Company, Manchester Incubation Limited, or something like that, and became one of the business development managers looking for spin-out opportunities. And that's my first engagement with what I've really grown to love throughout my career, which is that early stage, what I call fire starting engagement with early stage academic projects that want to be startups, need to understand how to put a team, a network, a group of people, a management team, and how to prepare for investment, because biotech, you very rarely go anywhere without investment in the early stage startup. So, and it was very successful. And again, yet another circumstance and situation, the University of Manchester decides to merge with the Manchester Institute of Science and Technology, UMIST. They have incubators, and they decide to make me managing director across all the incubators and incubation activity. So first exposure to managing buildings alongside managing the businesses in the building. And it's a really cool space to be in, because you're learning about infrastructure, about people, and about money, all in parallel. So that's how I explain it to my folks. My parents never understood how a PhD scientist really got into to business and into the science of business, and how infrastructure and buildings play an important part of that ecosystem. And then because of the success in Manchester, I was offered the opportunity to become the first CEO at the Stevenage Bioscience Catalyst. And it was a really weird situation, Steve, because I knew all my peers in the incubation science park movement were all going for it, for that job. And to cut a long story short, I was chosen to be that CEO, and it was a blank sheet of paper. It was me and GSK, and 2 empty buildings, and who knew? Who knew?
Well, you look
where
at it now. I mean,
it's
it's incredible. Yeah. How does it feel to be, looking back at that now, a few years on, and it's absolutely thriving and continuing to expand?
Feels awesome. I'm as proud of what we achieved in Manchester as I am of what we achieved in Stevenage, because of the hometown. Again, what you said early, not in the Golden Triangle, having to try harder to create ecosystems. And so the evolution of the Manchester incubator into what's happening at Alderley Park, for example, I'm equally as proud of. But Stevenage was just such an exciting adventure, an ability as a CEO to have a blank sheet of paper. And I use the football analogy to decide for yourself where you play with a flat back three or a 4-4-2 formation, and you bring everybody in, and it's your accountability and on your head be it. And as you know, there's no I in team, and it's all about the team. And the teams that I put together at Manchester and Stevenage, I'm equally as proud of. They worked so hard for me, for the vision, for the ambition, and they should be as proud of what's been achieved. And I'm equally as proud of the CEO that took over from me, Sally Ann Forsyth at Stevenage. She's done an incredible job, and she was, again, the right person at the right time with a different set of experiences and track record, coming from a science part, not non-scientific background. And that's exactly what Stevenage needed. It needed to transition from entirely about innovation into real hard infrastructure, property
Yeah, of
development,
course.
build for companies that were growing fast in a completely new industry. We helped
Yeah.
to create a new industry, Steve, around cell and gene therapies, and that's awesome.
It is. I mean, yeah, to look back on that and just to see how much it's booming. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating hearing you talking about your own personal development, and we'll come on to Discovery Park in a moment. It seems to be a combination of sort of being in the right place at the right time, but that's only a small part of it, really. I mean, we make our own luck, don't we? But it sounds like you've had the opportunity to get into some really interesting organizations, work with some great people, and then bring in presumably a really good combination of scientific knowledge and understanding, and also a more business-minded approach as well. So looking at the bigger picture and trying to really encourage those collaborations between people.
I think that's right. I'm a big fan. We'll talk about skills later, but project management skills are absolutely essential in that early stage, whether you're in the company or you're providing the services around the company. We don't have enough good project management at that early stage startup, unfortunately. And so an ability to use all that industry expertise in delivery on time, to budget, and against milestones has been absolutely pivotal in everything I do. And I'd like to think I've got a decent personality that allows me to interface with scientists in the same way that I interface with industry. That ability to absorb what the science is about and then turn around, vault fast, and talk to an investor in a language that they understand that isn't just about the science is as important. So that skill base and being able to have built that skill base up through academia, industry, and then working at that interface between academia and industry in incubation at Stevenage and subsequently at Discovery Park.
Yeah, I think there'll be people who listen to this who feel really inspired listening to it, because we and as a recruitment business, of course, we're speaking to a lot of people in the industry, a lot of people who have those kinds of qualifications, and you can speak to some people, and clearly they love working in the lab, they want to focus on something that's heavily scientific, but equally we might then come across somebody who demonstrates some of those extra skills that are really a lot more rare than you might think, and for a lot of people, they're not necessarily sure where their career could take them. So actually, one of the underlying messages that I'm getting here is that if you were to talk to your 25-year-old self, would he have known that you'd be where you are now at this stage in your career? So I
Absolutely
guess
not.
it's evolved. I guess it's having that open-mindedness to things along the way.
Well, that open-mindedness is the key, I think, to being open to opportunities that you may not have figured out for yourself, but actually when you write down on a piece of paper what the pros and cons and what you bring and what you might need to bring in alongside you. And,
Yes.
that's where I've been lucky. I've been able to always bring in where I'm weakest, to bring other people in. So, people will tell you I've had the best finance directors ever, because it's not a weakness, but I know I'm not as strong in that space, and it enables me to do the focus on the things where I am
Of
strongest.
course. Yeah, absolutely. Of course. So I was reading a recent article of yours in the business magazine, And I'd love to learn more about some of the initiatives that you described. You talked about attracting and nurturing new talent within Discovery Park, where you've been chairman for the last 4 years or so now, and
Yeah, since 2018.
since 2018. So yeah, and you said in this article, I remember reading, you said you believe it's the responsibility of all science parks, not just Discovery Park, to be as proactive as possible in encouraging people into STEM careers to become that next generation of developers and manufacturers. Just wonder if you can say a little bit more about that from your perspective.
Yeah. So two things, I think we've all learned as science park managers that it's not about the buildings. It's about the people and the ecosystem. And if you go, I differentiate between business parks, which are more about business, buildings and rental plays. You come in, you take your space, close your door, get on with what you're doing. Science parks are not intended to be that. They're supposed to be open innovation ecosystems, knowing what people next door or along the hallway are doing and how they might be able to interface with you and collaborate and partner. So it's all about that innovation ecosystem development. And I've been passionate that, we don't do a good enough job in the science parks to show our younger generation, our next generation of STEM and STEAM students, what career opportunities are available in our science parks and the breadth and the diversity, and not just being about PhD scientist roles, but all the way through from services, administration, marketing, business development, engineering, all of those components. There are jobs available on the science parks if you look and if you know where to look. And, we need to do better at that. And I'm trying to drive a national campaign across our science parks, working with the UK Science Park Association. I'm on the board at BioNow, which is the Northern membership for life sciences, and they're passionate about skills and next generation skills and career opportunities. Because, everybody's saying the same thing. If we're not careful, we're going to have significant gaps in our skill base. And there's, pandemics don't tend to bring too many good things out of them, but one good thing has been, the high profile and the raising of the profile of the importance in science to our community. And we need to get better at articulating that value proposition of science and the importance for patients, for all of us. I'm not getting any younger, Steve. All of the neuroscience space that I'm very keen on developing as a UK PLC approach to neurosciences, because no one entity, no one partner can do anything. But we're going to need the skills in data, in digital. Cell and Gene has shown the gaps around engineering, around the physical. New technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality are now impacting on how people are trained in cell and gene therapy spaces. So we need to be crystal ball gazing, and we need to keep an eye on the prize, and we need to show some passion and enthusiasm and motivation to encouraging our next generation about careers in science parks.
Of course, of course. Thinking about Discovery Park specifically, I just wondered if there was a particular emphasis within how you're promoting Discovery Park to potential collaborators, potential new partners coming in. Is there are you looking to be seen to be the centre of excellence for a particular area? Because at the moment, there's a fantastically diverse range of interesting innovation that goes on in Discovery Park. I wondered whether over time we start to see parks having individual specialisms.
I think that's almost inevitable, Steve, for the survival of the parks. I think it's good to have diversity, and Harwell is a great example of that diversity across automobiles, space, and life sciences. And, we're all good friends. We're all peers and colleagues because we don't compete. We deal with our own environment. So the environment for Discovery Park is a 220-acre site in Kent. Kent is a rural coastal location. Sandwich is beautiful and it's right on the sea, and therefore the dynamic and the innovation ecosystem will inevitably be different from that which you would find in an urban Manchester type ecosystem or a Golden Triangle innovation ecosystem across 3 cities but clearly linked and need to be linked better. So we have different challenges. The 220-acre site means that, with the number of facilities that we've got, it's very unlikely that we could become just a healthcare science park. And some of the skills around us in the local universities also dictate that there should be something in the hydrogen fuel cell space. We clearly are, the garden state. So, agriculture and agri-tech will be important. And so that balance between diversity and having focus is what we're doing right now. And the end game is to say, this is one of the few locations in the UK where you could create a manufacturing village for scale up in all of those sectors, and particularly around cell and gene therapy, where there's going to be a need for more scale up. I know it's near and dear to your heart, Steve, around GMP, manufacturing, scale up. We should be thinking ahead, and it can't all be about the Golden Triangle because they will be landlocked. And the first entity that puts manufacturing in London, I will be itching for a fight on that one, because that's completely inappropriate and it's not a UK PLC approach. So I think it's horses for courses. I think our focus is clearly, the legacy from having Pfizer on site is drug discovery, drug development, clinical development, manufacturing of small molecule drugs, and 70% of their drug manufacturing goes through the Sandwich site at the clinical development manufacturing stage, then into industrial biotech around agri-tech, hydrogen fuel cells and medicine manufacturing. And my big passion is to create a centre of excellence in neurosciences that engages the whole of the UK, and it's much needed to link and translate the fantastic science that we've got in neuroscience much better. And we're somewhere behind where we are in oncology and cancer in terms of translation, in terms of investment, in terms of evidence of success. Clinical trials of new drugs in neurosciences just isn't happening as quickly as it is in oncology, and we need to do better on that. And we will need the skills, Steve, to enable that to happen. And ultimately, many of those early stage companies that we bring to the park now, we're just setting up an incubator, for example, will lead to companies that will ultimately scale up and manufacture. So it's creating that innovation ecosystem that leads to products.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you think that is, out of interest? So if you said neuroscience is maybe behind where we are with oncology in terms of that clinical stage. How is that the case, would you say?
Well, two things, Steve. One is the appetite for oncology but from investors far exceeds that in neurosciences. The science is a little bit behind. The biology and the mechanisms of action of drugs in Alzheimer's and dementias is not fully known yet. We're still at that early stage translation. And then the bottom line for me, pharma has had significant clinical trial failures in neuroscience, which has meant that their appetite and their risk appetite has gone down significantly. But it's coming back. I can feel it all around me that investors can see that cell and gene is going to have an impact on some of the neuro diseases. They can see that some of the digital clinical trial approaches are going to have an impact on dementia clinical trials, for example. So we've got some seeds and some evidence of, I won't call it recovery, but of growth for appetite and interest from investors and pharma back into the neuroscience space. And don't forget, Pfizer had a neuroscience center, New Census in Cambridge. GSK had a big neuroscience center at Stevenage, which they dismantled, unfortunately. But that skill base is still around.
Yes, and it's about being able to harness that and keep encouraging that that kind of collaboration. I just wanted to sort of alongside that, so alongside attracting more people to Discovery Park and Discovery Parks and science parks more generally, I mean, what sort of insights can you give about how to encourage companies, so large and small companies, to actually form collaborative partnerships at more of a business to business level?
Yeah, my mantra is always don't. Your starting point should never be what about the IP or the intellectual property. It should be, what is the win-win? Open innovation is about taking a little bit more of a risk at an early stage to gain partnership and greater benefit downstream, and understanding that you can't do it all on your own, and therefore that appetite to engage and that resistance to go down the I must be protective of my intellectual property. Intellectual property and open innovation and innovation generally are not mutually exclusive. It's just timing. It's just protect and then engage. And so, it's a little bit more education and training and communication. Open innovation isn't a panacea. It's not a solution to everything, but partnership and collaboration, particularly in difficult, challenging areas where, Alzheimer's will not be solved by just one pharma company. It will require the whole supply chain, as we saw with the vaccines. So it's that mobilization. It shows what the vaccine story shows what can be done in a short period of time, all the way through to regulatory, if people are mobilized and understand the importance and criticality of working together. And that was, the mobilization of the supply chain in such a short period of time by the vaccines task force was nothing short of miraculous.
Yeah, I mean, just understanding only a tiny fraction of that from my own perspective, it just sounds incredible to have pulled people together so quickly. That real sense of urgency and everyone pulling in the same direction.
But the beautiful thing, Steve, was that they didn't have to try too hard. The task force didn't have to twist arms within the life science community. The life science community understood. And once they realized that there was alignment and a direction of travel, everybody jumped in. Government, they had a little bit more difficulty understanding the direction of travel, but they jumped in and they mobilized and they funded and they gap funded in the way that, but there will be a lot of learning points coming out of that whole journey and that whole line of travel that hopefully we'll get to see and share at some stage.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a really interesting conversation with Sheila Pardiai for our podcast, most recent one before this, and we were discussing about that. It can very easily become a disconnect between the developers, particularly thinking about the advanced therapy sector. The developers, these people have these amazing concepts, but not necessarily understanding that route through to the clinic and not understanding the end user. And actually, it links a lot to what you just said there about if there's a lot of that more joined up thinking, that people can actually see the whole picture, not just the specific area that they work in, not getting too fixated. If you're a developer, not getting fixated just solely on the IP side of things, but thinking, okay, what do we actually want this to look like? What do we want the patient experience to be?
100%.
And actually trying to get that from the outset.
I'm glad you raised that because, it gives me the opportunity to say I am an investor. I'm part of Discovery Park Ventures, £1 million fund, made 4 investments. And, part of our due diligence is always patient advocacy. The route to patient advocacy, FDA regulations. You can't start the conversation on the regulatory pathway, particularly if you're developing a gene therapy right now, because there are so many components of the ultimate drug or therapeutic that need regulation. So it's not just what your payload is, it's how you deliver it, it's where you deliver it. We've had a couple of FDA trials, as you know, that have, been put on hold.
Sure.
Because of efficacy and delivery to the wrong places. Hepatic liver delivery at the moment is a big challenge, and endosomal delivery by the actual, the actual delivery vehicle is crucial. So, the focus, it's like most evolutions of technologies don't usually end up with where you start. So, the delivery vehicle of choice has always been adenovirus or lentivirus. I don't think that's where we're going to end up. I think there'll be modifications of the gene delivery vehicle to address some of the FDA regulatory concerns around efficacy, toxicity, and all of that. Watch this space.
It's fascinating hearing.
That's what keeps
really
me going.
exciting. Yeah,
that's what gets me up in the mornings. That discovery. It's not just science discovery, but customer discovery. That is really important. You can't say that often enough to a young, geeky scientist who's got a great idea for a company. You know, it's what is the patient discovery? What's the customer discovery going to look like? And, you know, bless them, they look at you blankly, but you help them, you mentor them, you help them to understand why that's going to be important, and why when an investor asks them that question, they're going to be so pleased that I put them through the ringer.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. And speaking from your own personal experience as well, you know, coming full circle to what you said at the beginning of this and talking about your own career path and, you know, having that open-mindedness and just being receptive to different ideas and being excited about it. Excited, you know, you coming in at the, you know, a lot of these things hadn't been, you know, a lot of things hadn't been discovered at that point. So you've been able to see so much developing over the years and have so much involvement at that strategic level. It's really exciting to hear.
I guess I still have a frustration that, you know, we're not seeing enough diversity in our sector, and there's still a glass ceiling for female CEOs. That just reflects the whole conversation right back to where we started with not enough STEM and STEAM students, ethnic, cultural diversity coming through into our sector, and, you know, too many people like me in the way of that next generation coming through, and we need to step aside. We need to step aside into more mentoring roles, advisory roles, but get out of the way of these young, exciting, fantastic female CEOs and their management teams coming through. You know, and we're starting to see it. And Discovery Park Ventures hasn't made an intentional ambition of it, but the 4 investments we've made all have a high proportion of female representation at board level. And I want that. And, you know, I don't think there's anybody intentionally not doing it. It's that unconscious bias, Steve, isn't it? I don't know how we get through that.
Yeah, I think a great step in the right direction is the fact that people are actually talking about it. You know, you go back a few years, it wasn't even talked about, and it was
let's
a
keep
massive
talking
taboo.
about it, Steve. Let's keep
Totally
talking.
agree.
That sounds like a good place to finish.
It does. It does. Martino, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure meeting with you, and I really appreciate your insights. I think a lot of people are going to find it fascinating. So, yeah.
Thanks, Steve. As you could tell, I didn't enjoy that at all.
Well, congratulations with, you mentioned to me before this about some of the things that are happening later on today, and I have fingers crossed that everything continues to go well in all the different ventures you're involved in. And Martino, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for your time. Bye now.
Yeah, you're welcome. Bye-bye.